Operation Market Garden, launched on the 17th of September 1944, was one of the most ambitious Allied operations of World War II. As the largest airborne assault in history, its objective was to secure a series of 9 bridges in the Netherlands, carving out a path to Berlin that would bring the end of the war by Christmas. Despite its bold vision, Market Garden ultimately failed due to a combination of strategic miscalculations and unforeseen challenges. Yet it was more than military strategy that was the reason for its failure. It was betrayal from within that saw to it that the Germans were forewarned and thus forearmed ahead of the invasion. 2 key figures have emerged. The first, Christiaan Lindemans, also known as Agent King Kong, a Dutch double agent who leaked crucial information to the Germans. And perhaps even more intriguing, today's guest argues that it may have been a highly placed source within the British Secret Service, codenamed Josephine, who contributed to the prolongation of the war and the loss of thousands of Allied lives. Listen on for a fascinating discussion on bravery and sacrifice in war and the treachery that tore it all apart. Well, welcome everybody to the channel. I have something slightly different today, which is a conversation with Robert Vercake, who I'm very happy to have on the show with me. He's an accomplished and award-winning journalist and author. He's previously served as the Home Affairs editor of The Independent and the security editor on The Mail on Sunday. And Robert has written several fascinating books, including Jihadi John, The Making of a Terrorist. But what's brought him to have a conversation with me today is his most recent book, which is The Traitor of Arnhem, World War II's greatest betrayal and the moment that changed history forever. So firstly, Robert, welcome onto the channel and thank you very much for joining me today.
Very, very pleased to be here and thanks for inviting me, Philip.
Robert, if you could just set some of the historical scene for us, which is set out in your book. So we're heading towards the final phase of World War II. This is after the D-Day landings in Normandy. What's going on in Europe? And in particular, what was Operation Market Garden and what was its outcome?
Yeah, so we have to start with D-Day because this sets the tone and sort of geopolitical landscape for the next stage of Second World War. It was key, vital in it. I think it changed everything. It changed the political and the military perspective and the way that the military commanders fought the next stage of battle. That's both by the Russians and the Western allies. So after D-Day, which was a success, and it was a success that Stalin probably wanted. I mean, Stalin probably wanted it to be successful because it would involve the transfer of, he hoped, dozens of divisions from the eastern to the western front, and that therefore supporting his plan to launch Operation Bagration, which was dwarfed the scale of D-Day. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers against equal numbers of Germans. So it was big, and he delayed it for 2 weeks because the Allies were bogged down in the bogage in Normandy, and it looked like it was good. We were going back to 1914. This was going to be another stalemate on the Western Front. So this was all playing into Stalin's hands until, of course, we broke out from Normandy, and after the collapse of the German front and the Falaise pocket, the Germans were literally on the run. We were advancing. They were retreating faster than we could advance, and it looked like the war was almost won. It was just a case of the final blow, and the final blow was going to be Operation Market Garden. We're talking about September 1944, when the Allies had reached the Dutch-Belgian border and stopped for resupply and a rethink about the next stage of the war. The Market Garden was this daring operation dreamt up by General Montgomery, and the idea was to take key bridges over the Rhine, outflank the Siegfried line, and get us into the heart of the Ruhr, and then neutralize German industry, and the whole military machine was going to collapse, and we'd be in Berlin by Christmas. And the central part plan was this daring air landing. So we're talking about 40,000 paratroopers and glider troops who were going to be dropped on 3 bridges, Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and ultimately Arnhem, which was the bridge that the British were supposed to take. And having secured the bridge, the armor of 30 Corps, this was Montgomery's lead military armor force, would charge up a 60-mile road to Arnhem through the bridges and accomplish Operation Market Garden. And we're all over in 2 days. War will be won. Game, set, and match. But of course, it didn't turn out like that. There are many reasons for that, which perhaps we're going to talk about.
Would it be safe to say that after Normandy and Allies had established a foothold on the continent, that it was now a race to Berlin, and the dynamics between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were a little bit different, and they were now squaring up for the seeds of the ideological battle that was to come in decades were now focused on Berlin and who was going to get there first. Is that a fair sort of assessment of where we're standing?
I mean, I believe, and lots there are Russian generals and defectors who would say the same, that the Cold War began. Perhaps the Cold War began before that, but certainly conventional wisdom is Cold War started after the end of the Second World War. Well, I think it started before. I think Stalin's mentality was very much Cold War mentality after Normandy, and the race to Berlin was then. But unfortunately, the Western Allies, the Americans, the British, were divided in terms of how and what they perceived the Russian threat to be. So Churchill, very much acutely aware of the kind of overall global plan for Europe that Stalin had, and Roosevelt less concerned perhaps, and perhaps taken in more by Stalin. So I mean, I think Operation Market Garden was a political as much as a military enterprise, and probably suffered as a result.
Okay. And so we, of course, know that Operation Market Garden wasn't a success. So the Allies didn't manage to create their bridgehead over the lower Rhine, specifically in Arnhem. And what were the reasons for that failure? I know we're going to delve into some of the intelligence failures, but just purely from a battlefield point of view, I understand that resistance was a lot heavier than expected. What other sort of factors played into the military failure?
Yeah, I think there are several reasons why. And remember, it very nearly succeeded. It was on a knife edge for a long time, and it was only the last day or two when we conceded defeat. We didn't reach that last bridge at Arnhem. But I think the obvious problems with it were, one was underestimating the fighting morale of the German soldiers. We thought we had all but won the war. The British officers take their golf clubs and dinner jackets, with them. They expected a sort of parade into Berlin. So we underestimated the fighting abilities of the Germans, and the Germans are very good at resourceful fighting units. So their NCOs were good at organizing counterattack defensive positions. They didn't need officers to set out a grand plan. They were very good at improvisation, and that was something that we didn't appreciate. So there was that. On our side, there were problems with the plan itself. Obviously, it was extraordinarily daring. It carried many risks. The planners Boy Browning knew all about. And these were, they didn't have enough transport aircraft to get all the soldiers, all the paratroopers and the guard troops onto the landing grounds in one go. They had to do 2 or 3 landings, so that was a problem. Arnhem was particularly difficult because they chose a landing site 8 miles outside Arnhem. So even when the 1st Airborne Division had landed, they still had an 8-mile march into Arnhem. So that gave the Germans enough time to organize themselves. And plus, of course, the 2nd Panzer Corps were resting up in the Arnhem area. So there were the 9th and 10th divisions were, they weren't anything like what they had been in Normandy, because they were being battered to bits, but they were still a fighting force that we hadn't anticipated, and they obviously played a decisive role in the counterattack at Arnhem and also at Nijmegen, because I think one of the divisions was sent to Nijmegen and the other one countered the British attack on Arnhem. So there was that. There was also, the radios failed, so we had bad communication. We lost the commanding officer early on, who got caught on the way to Arnhem. He had to hide up. There were all sorts of things that went wrong, that perhaps it hadn't gone wrong, Operation Market Garden might have succeeded. I mean, we can also talk about the decisions by the American General Gavin, who was in charge of 82nd Division. I mean, he was considered to be a little bit too cautious, in the sense that he was more interested in defending his position by occupying the hills around Nijmegen. And you could also argue that Brian Horrocks, who was in charge of 30 Corps, was also a little timid.
Just before we move forward, I know from the opening of your book you have a bit of a personal connection to this story of the life in the Netherlands during World War II and Operation Market Garden. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the reason I wrote this book was because I've got a relative called Eddie Vercake, who was a resistance fighter, communist resistance fighter, based in Eindhoven, and his story was interesting all on its own for me, because he led a communist resistance force after the British and Americans had entered Eindhoven. So we're talking about September the 18th. He was among a group of fighters who confronted a Waffen SS unit, and he thought he was taking the surrender of this unit, when in fact the German officer sort of presented himself with a white flag. But when Eddie went to take the surrender, he was gunned down by the Germans. So he's an interesting character because of his background. He was was an ordinary clerk, and he probably typified a lot of Dutch people and the way that they were prepared to fight for their liberation and oppose the occupation. And that's why I got drawn into writing about Operation Market Garden.
So your book addresses the reality of Operation Market Garden having been betrayed from within, and all sorts of things going on in the intelligence world that caused or led to some of the military and logistical issues that we're faced, that we've just discussed. And in that sort of context, there's 2 key figures who emerge in this whole thing. So the number one, Christiaan Lindemans, and then a more mysterious person called Agent Josephine. And firstly, who was Christiaan Lindemans? What role did he play in betraying Allied war plans?
Christiaan Lindemans, he was also linked to. I got into him through Eddie Vercake, because Eddie Vercake knew him in Eindhoven after he was finally captured. So Lindemans' story is an extraordinary story. I mean, it's a man who was born in Rotterdam. He was there when the Germans bombed Rotterdam and destroyed his father's garage business. He had grievance against the Germans, obviously. I mean, most Dutch people did, but he decided to join a communist resistance organization called the CS6, and he set up a very effective um, um, counter-German outfit, and this included attacks on Germans and running escape lines and passing people down the lines all the way to Britain. And he was working with the SOE, who had been sent out from London. But he was a rather larger than life character. You know, some might describe him as a bit of a psychopath because he was easily drawn to temper. He would, if you crossed him, you would either get in a fight or you'd see that he was carrying a gun. You know, he was a playboy. He had many different women in all parts of the escape lines wherever he turned up. But he was compromised because his wife, she'd been captured by the Germans, and he was very angry about that, very worried about it. I think partly because he was partly responsible for that. He may well have actually given up her name by accident. But it was also his brother had also been captured by the Germans, and he'd introduced his brother to the escape line, so he felt responsible for his brother. So he came to the Germans in March 1944 with an offer. He said, "Look, you release my girlfriend and my brother, and I will work for you." And this was an extraordinary offer, and one that the German head of military intelligence, the Abwehr, his name was Hermann Gisks, readily accepted, because the reputation of Lindemans, it was known as King Kong among his friends, British. He was, because of his awesome sort of strength and temper. But he also had contacts with all the resistance lines. Gisks knew that if he had Lindemans, he would have access to all these resistance groups and their escape lines, and
so it's like manna from heaven for the Abwehr.
And this is exactly what happened. He delivered up 267 names, many of whom were arrested and others were executed. So it was a monstrous treachery on Lindemans' part. So in terms of his intelligence, because the British and the Dutch hadn't realised that he had switched sides, he was extraordinarily useful to Gisks, and even Gisks had him trying to find out the details for D-Day, as lots of German agents were, and he came pretty close to delivering it. But in Operation Market Garden, he came into his own, because the British had decided to use him as part of a team of agents who were going to contact the Dutch resistance in Eindhoven and warn them about the operation, i.e., keep your heads down, tell the resistant groups to wait until we're attacking Eindhoven, until this is 30 Corps, the arrival of 30 Corps. That's when we'll need you the most. So Lindemans, working with British Special Forces, crossed the line on September the 15th and immediately gave himself up to the Germans. And he went to Kurt's students' headquarters, where he was debriefed. And then when the Germans realized exactly who he was sent back to Dreibeken, where the German military intelligence headquarters was, and he was for 36 hours he was debriefed very closely. Reams of intelligence was taken off him, and during that time, he gave up important information about Operation Market Garden. The question really has always been, how much did he know, and how seriously did the Germans take this intelligence? And some people say that that the Germans knew quite a lot about Market Garden anyway. So what he was telling them, which was largely, he was telling them about the Eindhoven offensive. I mean, this must have been pretty obvious, given that there was a huge build-up of troops and armor. The German knew something was happening. I mean, there had been German intelligence officers, members of the debriefing team, who said that he identified Arnhem as the objective, and action was taken. Small units were dispatched to Arnhem as a result of his intelligence.
Yeah, and the way I see it in all matters of espionage and intelligence, there's never going to be one single source of truth. It's a massive tapestry and web of sources and information coming in, but every person that feeds into that can make a difference, and it can often be a very small tidbit of information that completely changes the outcome of things. So certainly a big player in the scheme of things in that part of the war. And now turning to the mysterious Agent Josephine, who was she or he or this person or people?
Agent Josephine was an agent being run by 1943, probably Germany's top spy master, who hasn't really received the recognition that he deserves. But his name was Karl-Heinz Kramer. He was a sort of member of the Bavarian gentry. He was based in Stockholm with his wife and family. He was military attaché, but really was the Abwehr's man in Stockholm. And he ran a number of agents. One of them he codenamed Agent Josephine. And Josephine had been providing the Germans with sort of mixed intelligence reports since about 1940, beginning of 1942, maybe towards the end, and 43. And this intelligence had been mostly about air production figures, about location of Allied forces, and certainly towards 1944, Allied forces building up on in Britain in advance of D-Day. This kind of stuff, and it was taken very seriously. It was considered to be, as I say, Germany's best spy, and his intelligence was often given to Hitler directly. So, and Josephine was part of it. Josephine, he said, was a English hostess who had simply got her contacts among the British establishment, and she used cocktail parties and her own contacts to winkle out intelligence, which was passed back to him.
Okay. But you don't buy that story, no doubt, and we think there's a more prominent and controversial figure behind the Josephine mask.
Yeah, so Josephine becomes really important in D-Day, and then again in Market Garden. So Josephine in D-Day delivers intelligence to the German High Command, which mirrors Operation Fortitude, which was the Allies' deception plan. So Josephine's intelligence was telling the Germans that Pas de Calais was the location for the invasion beaches, and this is all this tallied very well with what Agent Garbo was saying, and helped the Allies a great deal, because it was this intelligence which ultimately stopped Hitler ordering the reserve panzers to attack the British and Americans 24 hours after the build-up. Hitler decided to hold back his panzers because he still thought the main thrust of the invasion was going to be Pas-de-Calais. And this was partly because of not just what Garbo was saying, but what Josephine was saying. So,
and so do you think that was just good luck that the intelligence fed back aligned with the Allied misdirection strategy, or was it intentional, or coincidence?
It could have been. It could have been good luck. I mean, Kramer was, he was quite willing to make stabs in the dark, and he would use military periodicals on which to base his intelligence reports, and then put code names like Josephine and Hector on them. But I mean, he said he was very confident about this report, this Josephine report, and it was used to create effect. He believed it, Hitler believed it, and the beneficiaries were the British and American forces who were landing on the beaches. But I think it was his intelligence later on where he gives himself away. Sorry, when I say he, I mean gender still be But Josephine, when it comes to Market Garden, we get to see the true color of the intelligence. So on September the 16th, 1944, Foreign Office in Berlin, teleprinter clatters away with a message from Agent Josephine via Karl-Heinz Kramer in Stockholm. And this message is in fact a very detailed account of Operation Market Garden. Kind of detail that you can't guess at. You either know it or you don't. So Kramer, or Josephine, is saying that there are going to be 3 divisions involved in an airborne operation on the 17th of September at 2 o'clock. It's going to be the 82nd American Division, 101st American Division, and the 1st British Airborne Division. And Arnhem is the objective. It's an extraordinarily detailed piece of intelligence that, unfortunately for the Germans, sits in their sits in the teleprinter office for a full 24 hours. It doesn't arrive on the battlefield until the afternoon of the 17th. That's when the Allied airborne forces is landing, or is just in the air over Holland. But it still plays an important part because, as Walter Schellenberg says, he's the head of the SF military intelligence at this point. He says that Josephine's intelligence meant that the Germans recognized the scale of the operation. They knew what the objectives were. It helped them to understand the British and American battle plan. So it was pretty vital intelligence. Whether it made a critical difference or not, we can argue until the cows come home. It's very hard to say. Well, because the operation was so finely balanced, I think it probably did make a difference. But there was an awful lot going on at the time. So but on top of this, Josephine was also feeding this deceptive, or was countering. This time was countering Agent Brutus, who was like Garbo, was a British double agent who the Germans trusted. Josephine was saying, ignore Brutus or Garbo or any of the other agents who say that there will be a combined sea and air operation. Forget the sea operation. It's not going to happen. It's just an air landing, which was useful because that's exactly what Agent Brutus' deception material was saying. He was trying to trick the Germans into believing that there was going to be another attack by sea, which obviously never materialized. So Josephine, quite important in Operation Garden, if you think intelligence can win battles.
Yeah, absolutely. And so turning to who you argue is the prime candidate for Agent Josephine, a good old friend, Anthony Blunt. And this is how you and I got to speaking, because I did a video on my channel covering Anthony Blunt, and relied quite substantially on your book for some of the biographical elements of that, as well as some of the other Blunt biographies floating about. Very infamous and controversial figure, particularly in British history, and a member of the Cambridge Five. But tell us a bit more about Anthony Blunt and where he starts to fit into this picture.
Okay, so Anthony Blunt isn't in my book at this point. I'm writing about these two betrayals. This second betrayal, the on the 16th, the teleprinter Josephine. I only came across that quite late in my research. So I'm looking at two betrayals. I don't know anything about Anthony Blunt. But Anthony Blunt is, as you say, one of the Cambridge Spies. He's a Russian agent. He was recruited about 1934. He's, the problem with Blunt is he's overprivileged. I think he feels underprivileged. He's from a Hampshire clergy family. He's homosexual. He probably feels a bit like an outsider, and he's a student at Oxford. He's a student at Cambridge, and he's caught up in the whole anti-fascist, sort of pro-communist milieu, and he's a young man with political ideals, and he's ripe for radicalization. Blunt's recruited to Russian intelligence. By 1940, he's working for MI5. He's not just working for MI5. He is the assistant to head of counterintelligence Guy Liddell, and he then helps him sort of branch out to take over a number of key roles in MI5 B branch, including he has control over the triplex documents. And triplex is top secret. We only found out about it a few years ago. But triplex was the Allies or MI5's breaking into the diplomatic bags of the neutral countries who were based in Britain, and we could, by doing that, we could find out what intelligence they had from the Axis countries, and
wasn't
also
very gentlemanly.
Not very gentlemanly at all, and that's why we've only really recently owned up to it. But obviously, if you want to plant some intelligence on the enemy without knowing, that's not a bad way to do it. And Blunt had also a number of sub-agents working for him. Some of them MI5 knew about. Some of them were purely recruited for his Russian spy masters. These included people in military intelligence and agents who were simply loyal to him and who were working within the embassies. So, and he was also a channel for the exchange of intelligence between MI5 and MI6, because there was quite a bit of friction between MI5 and MI6 during the war about who should take control of the intelligence, particularly the decrypts from Bletchley Park. But Blunt was a key man in terms of who would see what. So how is he possibly linked to Agent Josephine working for the Germans? Well, when you start to investigate Agent Josephine, you realize that the British, the MI5, had set up a team of investigators who were looking into Josephine. And the prime investigator was Major Anthony Blunt. And it is Blunt who tries to establish the identity of Josephine. And time again, he is told that Josephine is probably working for the Russians. He's someone who's got intelligence that could only have come via the Russians. He's got contacts. Kramer's got contacts with the Russians. Surely he must have some involvement with the Russians. And time again, Blunt tells MI6, who believe this, that it's complete rubbish, and there's no strength to that story at all. The man is just simply he's either making it up, or he's got a Swedish source who's called who's the Swedish military attaché in London called Frank Cavell. He says it's him, but it turns out it couldn't possibly be Cavell, because the intelligence that Josephine has access to after D-Day, or in fact during D-Day, takes place when Cavell is sent back to Sweden, and so and never really had that kind of access anyway. Kind of certainly a market guy.
So how did the Allies come to learn of Josephine in the first place? Was that purely through intercepted communications from Kramer?
They first discovered that there was an Agent Josephine through the Americans. Actually, it was in Bern, a German defector, Franz Kolbe, told the Americans in Switzerland about Kramer and this Agent Josephine, and we didn't take it seriously. The Americans did. When the Americans pressed it upon us, we did start looking at Josephine, and that's when we placed an MI6 officer, Peter Falk, in Stockholm, and he managed to get access to Kramer's office, and he got to see all the intelligence that Josephine was well, not all of it, but most of it that he was receiving, because Falk had made friends with or recruited the Kramer's housekeeper, and she'd taken a strong dislike to the Kramer, especially Mrs. Kramer, who was a little bit grand and a little bit offensive to the housekeeper. So the housekeeper had a bit of a grudge, and MI6 exploited that. So we had an in on Kramer. So we found we could see that Kramer and Josephine were working together. We just didn't know who it was, and that was at the point when we launched an investigation. And
just on the piece on the housekeeper, I found that story just fascinating. Just good old espionage, where she makes an impression of the key to the safe in a bar of soap, and that gets sent back, and they managed to
butter. Actually, yeah, there was a pat of
butter.
Sorry,
yeah. Butter. Yes.
Yeah.
No, brilliant. Okay, so we're starting to see a few dots forming. How do you start joining those dots into an arrow that points towards Major Anthony Blunt?
To this stage, all I'm thinking is that Blunt is leading an investigation into a German spy, but he's not taking any of the MI6 intelligence seriously. And I then discover, and not through files actually, but a memoir written by Peter Falk, which I don't think has been published, but in it, Falk says that he meets Blunt at the Reform Club in 1943, and with him, he says he's got the contents of Kramer's safe, and inside it are extraordinarily sensitive documents, including the actual minutes of conversations between Roosevelt and Churchill in Quebec at a meeting that took place earlier in the year, as well as British cabinet documents as well. And he's so concerned about this, and he doesn't trust anyone else to look at it, because he thinks that if he goes to MI6, they'll bury it, and he thinks it's something to do with London. So he flies back from Stockholm and meets Blunt at the Reform Club in London, and he shows him the documents, and Blunt says, "Oh, really? This is absolutely nothing. This can't be serious." And because I don't believe that the Russians would have any interest in any of this material at all, because Falk is convinced that the Russians are somehow involved, and according to Falk, when he persists with this idea, Blunt loses his temper. And we're talking about a very cool, calm, collected officer. He really does lose it. He loses his temper and tells him that, look, just give the documents to me. Let me handle it. Don't you worry. Everything will be safe with me. And so Falk returns to Stockholm, thinking it's all been taken care of, but of course it hasn't been taken care of. We hear nothing about any of this. It's only in Falk's memoir that we know that this actually happened. There's no record of this ever happening. So this is when I start to think that perhaps there's a bit more to Anthony Blunt and Josephine than perhaps I had previously thought. And
so where does that lead you next?
Well, that leads me to trying to work out what happens next in terms of the Josephine investigation. And what happens next is that we actually capture Kramer before the end of the war, and Kramer is interrogated at Camp O20 in Richmond by MI5 officers about his involvement in intelligence, and where are his sources. And obviously Josephine is one of the first agents to crop up, and guess who is leading the interrogation? It's Major Blunt again. And it's fascinating because you start reading the memos and the intelligence related to the interrogation, and you can just see that there's an awful lot of interest in trying to establish who Josephine is. How could he possibly have got this? How could he have possibly got this intelligence? And who is the mole? And Blunt repeatedly tries to derail this line of inquiry, and throughout the whole interrogation, he does a number of things, including, he refuses to interview Kramer's secretary. He dismisses the idea that Josephine is involved with Russian intelligence. He constantly tries to present Kramer and Josephine, it presents Josephine as a sort of made-up entity, and there's nothing to see here. Don't worry about it. But at no point does he ever try to establish how Josephine got the Arnhem intelligence. At no point does he ask any of the right questions. And it is Blunt who is investigating Kramer right to the end of October 1945. And the very last moment, when Blunt leaves MI5, he retires from MI5 in October 1945. His last act is to close the Kramer file, send Kramer back to Germany. So there's that. Then,
but on the investigation point, I suppose, just playing devil's advocate, Blunt would have been quite keen to shut down any idea that this Josephine person was in any way linked to the Russians or Soviets, knowing that, he was a spy for the Soviets, so he wouldn't have wanted anybody sniffing around there, just purely for the sake that he wouldn't want himself to
see,
become under
yeah.
suspicion, setting aside the whole Josephine supplying information to the Nazis.
Yeah.
Like that could possibly be one reason that he reacted in that way.
Absolutely. I mean, he needn't be Josephine to want to close down the investigation. Yeah, if there was a suggestion that it was a Russian, then that would, he would also want to do it for those reasons. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But as you know, I put together, I think, more than 50 reasons why I think Blunt is Josephine. I mean, one of the other ones is that on the day that the microdot intelligence lands in Kramer's mailbag in Stockholm, that's the 15th. So he gets it on the 15th, doesn't deliver it until the 16th of September. On that day, in the Moscow files, there's a report of Blunt meeting his Russian handler in London, extremely agitated, emotionally, wrought, and asking his handler to let him go, saying that am I only leaving MI5, but I don't want anything more to do with Russian intelligence. Which again, is, I think, you can argue is evidence of a man who has just done something so concerning, perhaps to his conscience as much as anything else, that he wants out. Moscow archive reports of him being paid money and rewarded with praise and cash. A couple of
I saw that in a sort of unusual praise that not many others spies for the Soviets had received at that time, so suggesting that he was of particular use to them.
That's right. But I suppose I'm almost going to say lastly, but it's never lastly with Blunt. He was an expert in microdot technology. He was the one who MI5, MI6 used to go to when they wanted someone to explain to them how, because the Germans and the Russians were very good at using microdots, and he was considered the sort of in-house expert on microdot technology, which was exactly how Kramer had received these microdots. Something that apparently Kramer said he'd never received before. He'd never received or understood microdots until the Josephine material turned up. I think that is interesting, perhaps significant. But obviously, Kramer said he got the intelligence, he got the microdots in his mailbag. And again, we've already established that it's Blunt who is in charge of mailbags, and the route that the intelligence came was it was a Hungarian legation via Madrid. And we had lots of resource in Madrid, and it's easy to see how that kind of intelligence could have been planted in Kramer's mailbag.
Now, I think looking at the question of whether Blunt was Josephine, there are so many obfuscations, so little information, and investigating this from your point of view so many decades later, very unlikely that you're going to find an absolutely smoking gun. It's more a question of every additional inquiry seems to be leading you to the foot or the same door of Mr. Blunt, and it's more of a cumulative case that you have to look at holistically, as opposed to saying, well, this single piece of evidence is what led you to draw this particular conclusion. And that's the way I've read your book and understood your argument. And until yes,
until last week, and I'm offering this up as an exclusive scoop.
It's a scoop for
Philip Thompson Media.
Brilliant.
So last week, MI5 declassified 100 files, and 23 of them were on Anthony Blunt. And I've spent the last week going through, I haven't gone through all of them actually. I've only managed, because they're about, I mean, each file is about 200 pages long. We're talking about, more than 5,000 new pages, but mostly is mostly on his interrogation and interviews and the investigation into Blunt. But this is the most this is the most detailed series of documents that we've seen relating to Blunt. So obviously I had a bit of an interest, and one of the things that has come up in the files that I've seen is an admission by Blunt that he was working with another Cambridge spy who was one of the apostles, the secret group who were in Cambridge, and Blunt and Burgess were members of, and so was this other spy. And this new Cambridge spy, who he says he was working with, was reporting directly to the Russian military attaché in London. And not only that, but this particular spy had stepped up his operations in 1943 and had actually been treading on Blunt's territory, and Blunt had to go back to his handler to try and warn him off. But the key thing about this Agent X, I'm calling him, is that he was part of a special forces group, and he was leading a unit which was to take part in the landings in Arnhem. He's one of the spearhead intelligence units which was going to take part in Operation Market Garden. And in fact, he did take part in Operation Market Garden. He landed outside Arnhem, was captured very quickly, and had to destroy all his equipment, so he says, and became a prisoner of war, and was being considered a Russian suspect by MI5 ever since. And in fact, not only ever since, but before he took part in Operation Market Garden, Roger Hollis, who was head of counter-Russian intelligence for MI5, wrote to his commanding officer in 1943 and said, under no circumstances must Agent X ever serve outside the United Kingdom, and certainly have no access to any sensitive material. But miraculously, and the files do not explain how Hollis had made this perfectly clear to his commanding officer, and his commanding officer agreed. A year later, he is in Arnhem leading a very secret radio communications team. And I think that is fascinating, and it answers one of the questions that I've never really been able to answer, and was that how did Blunt get hold of the accurate intelligence about Market Garden? Because Market Garden was only actually approved by Eisenhower on September the 10th. It was only 7 days before the operation. Kramer had the full plan 5 days later, September the 15th. So how did Blunt or Josephine, whoever Josephine was, how did they get the intelligence so quickly and get it to Kramer so quickly? And how did they get it into the hands of the Germans? And, Agent X kind of helps to explain that, because Agent X obviously knew all about Operation Market Garden, and he had a direct line to the military attaché in London.
Okay, well, it's all the pieces are starting to fall together now. And you said there's many other files at National Archives. Are you going back to do a bit more digging?
Yes. Yeah. I'm probably only I would say only about halfway through the Blunt stuff. I mean, there's a lot more on Philby I haven't even started looking at, and other MI5 files as well relating to the time. But it's amazing. What I find remarkable about these files is that the emphasis is always on, because this was 1960, Blunt, this mission wasn't until 1964. So the emphasis is never on what did you tell the Russians during the Second World War? What secrets did you give over? It's always, who did you know? Where are they now? And can you help us with investigations which are ongoing? There was never seems to be any interest in what part of betrayal, treachery he took part in. So,
Yeah, well, it seems that I mean, from the TV interview that he did, and he very begrudgingly made admissions, and I mean, styled his decision as being compelled by his conscience to have spied for the Soviets. And of course, we're not looking at the Nazi angle. But yeah, I think that's why the whole episode in British history and intelligence history has been so controversial. I mean, he continued in his position of surveyor of the Queen's pictures until his treachery was finally revealed by Margaret Thatcher in the House of Commons, and that's when the House of Cards fell down around him. But it would seem he essentially got away with it for the most of his life. He lived a few more years after it all came to light, but there's clearly so much more that has never seen the light of day. Perhaps it's now the other things that he was involved in are coming to light. And just a truly fascinating tale. Your book, I guess I could say it's somewhat of a radical hypothesis or new hypothesis, in the sense that Blunt was a, self-described committed anti-fascist, became a communist at Cambridge because he saw communism as the sort of only remaining bulwark against fascism sweeping across Europe. And so the question then is, of course, well, would he have ever helped the Nazis in some way, having the ideological stance that he had? Some of the comments on my video on Anthony Blunt have raised it, saying, well, if the Soviets, I'm just going to read a comment out as it was left by one of the viewers, John Kelly, says there's a fatal flaw in the traitor of Arnhem narrative. If the Soviets wanted the Nazis to know about Market Garden, they need not have risked Blunt. They would have simply passed his intelligence to the Nazis via another channel. This would have left Blunt and British counterintelligence none the wiser. What do you make of that? I mean, do you consider that a possibility?
I mean, that could. I mean, that's partly possible. I mean, the only thing I would say about that is they did need Blunt because of his access, and we just discussed that. We just talked about how do you get hold of GHQ material within 5 days of it being handed to the generals, and it's all about access. Not so Blunt had that access, and as we've just talked about, had very, very, very exclusively good access to that kind of intelligence. So they needed Blunt. I mean, they also needed MI6's access to, if they're going to plant it, then they needed MI6's access to Kramer as well. And Blunt was part of that. Obviously, Peter Falk was part of that, but his skills and access were unique and essential to any operation which was going to deceive the Germans about Operation Market Garden. But it may be ultimately he may not have known, he himself may not have known where the intelligence or where the intelligence was going to end up, or what the intelligence was. I can see that being possible because the Russians had such a sophisticated penetration operation, and they had what they did in London with the Cambridge Spies. They could do it. They did all in all capitals all over the world, especially neutral countries like Sweden, and Stockholm was full of Russian agents. But they still needed any of the access to the intelligence first. They needed access to Kramer. They needed to make it all credible. And how much Blunt knew of all that is another matter.
But whether he knew it or not, my view of it is that he made a decision to pass on sensitive information to people that he shouldn't have. So as soon as he makes that decision, he crosses that line, and I just don't think he can claim any kind of innocence once he's done that. So knowing full well that once that intelligence is gone somewhere because of him, just the mere fact that he can't control where it goes beyond that, in my view, at least, doesn't absolve him of anything. So either way, he's guilty.
I agree with that. But also, I would question this idea. That he's an idealist communist who's fighting fascism in any form it takes, and it's only communists who can defeat fascism. I mean, you got to remember that between 1939 and 1941, the communist Russia and Nazi Germany were allies, and it was during that time that Blunt and the other Cambridge spies were working for the Russians. They were effectively, they didn't know where their intelligence was going to end up. They were effectively working for the Nazis because the Nazis and the communists were running a joint intelligence enterprise. And the other thing is, he was, in Cambridge, he had one of his boyfriends was a guy called Mickey Burns, who was, he was a fascist. He was a Mosleyite. How much of an idealist Blunt was is based on how much of an idealist Blunt tells us he was. And yet, you look at these files, my files in the archive, there are reams of Blunt sort of naming friends who he's dropping in it, or just communists. And there's no evidence that they are working for the Russians. They're just. But he's very happy, despite being an idealist, to drop lots of his friends in the hot soup, and would involve extremely uncomfortable investigations by MI5. So we've got this idea of him as an idealist feat who was an art expert, who just simply was he was simply misunderstood the situation, and it's a shame, but his treachery wasn't evil. It was just a kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah, and that's certainly how he tried to portray it during that famous TV interview that he did. I'm just interested to know. So your book has been published in the UK, and it's due to be published in the US on is it the 3rd of February?
Yeah. But I would say that the English edition of the paperback, which is coming out April, will be revised to take account of what I've discovered from this new MI5 release in the files last week. So you'll get a name for Agent X, and you'll get more details about Blunt and what he was up to.
No, I'm looking forward to it. And another question I have is, how has your hypothesis or cumulative case for Blunt been received by other historians, those who have covered the Blunt story themselves, biographers, etc.?
Yeah, I'm mixed. I mean, some of it has been, I would describe as unreasonably hostile, even though I didn't set out to assassinate Anthony Blunt. Not that he needed much assassination, but I simply followed. I followed the evidence, and this is where it led me. I didn't even want to write about Anthony Blunt, but it was impossible to ignore him, and I think that these new files completely, I think some of the books written about are apologies for his betrayal, and no one's ever bothered to ask what did he actually do. I mean, he's handed over 1,777 documents to the Russians. We know that because they're in the Moscow archives. We need to know what they were. We need to know what sort of level of treachery was he involved in, and we're now beginning to find out, because there are lots of this stuff is coming out in in the files. And I think, it's been too easy to accept his word on his motives and the level of his treachery.
No, certainly. And as I say, he tried to create a persona for himself when he made his exit from the intelligence world. But as you say, his word probably doesn't carry much weight in what came to light many decades later. And I also saw in the news that the newly released MI5 files spoke of how the Queen was kept in the dark for a number of years after British intelligence discovered the treachery, and the reports I've seen have said that was to not unduly disturb the Queen, who would have been dealing with Blunt quite a bit. He was within the royal court, and also, I guess, for a measure of plausible deniability. So there's so many factors at play here, and vestiges of the British establishment that people are still trying to protect. And I guess it's great to see that these files are being released. Why it took so long, I don't know, but I'm looking forward to the next chapter in the saga, and in particular the revised edition of your book.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was great, and really enjoyed discussing it. I think there's a lot, we could have twice as much time on this topic, and I think we'd still be talking about it, because there's so many avenues to go down.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Robert, thank you very much for joining me today. Of course, I will have links to purchase your book in the description of the video. Do highly recommend it. And once again, Robert, thank you very much, and perhaps we'll be speaking to you again soon.
Thanks, Philip. Good to speak.